If you would like to tweet about things that you see tonight because you are excited about them, we have this hashtag, which is learn with Rangle? Yeah, that's the one. Not learn at Rangle, learn with Rangle. And I am here to talk to you about Storybook and why you should be excited about it. My name's Adam, and I am a very excitable developer sometimes. And I'm hoping to share my excitement for this tool with you. This has been part of my workflow for the last year, and it's just made my life so much better. So I figured I'd talk about it. So what is it? This is a tool. It's a place to build and view your UI components, which is isolated from the rest of your application. So there it is. This is the Storybook interface. And let me make sure my cursor is in the right place. Yeah. So say you're building a sign-up form, and it's going to be built of many little pieces. So you might start by building, there's going to be an activity indicator for when this thing is submitting, so you build that little activity indicator component. And then, there's going to be a button for when you submit things, so you build this button. And I've already got a place to view these little bits before I even assemble them into a form. And you just keep going and setting up your components in different states. You can have a checkbox, because those are useful. Yeah. I can try. Plus size that. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, now you can read the text on the side. That's great. So you start building, like I said, you're building up your individual components outside of the website that they're going to exist in one day. And you can start building them into larger and larger pieces. Let's see if I can make this go away. Yes. So let's see, expand this one. So you go from a text input to a text input that also has a label and room for an error underneath of it. And you can start building these things out and testing them too. So our components are driven by props, and I can start editing props right through the GUI rather than having to edit my file, save it, wait for things to reload. I've got some nice live editing right here. It's also really good for finding weird states that your interface might get into. Like, inputs could be touched, as in you've already entered something. But if it's untouched and something's invalid, you may not want to show an error below there, because just because the user hasn't entered anything yet doesn't mean it's invalid. So it can help you discover weird edge cases like this as you're going through and building your components. And then you can start composing them into forms. Where's that one? That was the one I wanted. And you can get, you can use your actual form libraries in here and interact with them. You can check what happens. Oh, gotta fill this one out the right way. You can also hook up your callbacks so that the responses, so that the arguments you pass them show up right in the user interface. So now I know what this form would pass on to another component if if something else passed it on. This tool, Storybook, is surprisingly popular on GitHub. I hadn't looked at it in a while, but it's actually up to like 646 releases and 850 contributors. This is huge. I also had no idea that it had grown outside of the React ecosystem, but I'm looking at these tags and going, this thing supports Vue and Svelte and Ember. Oh, my cursor's on the wrong screen. There you go. Vue and Svelte. So many communities have adopted this. A lot of people seem to think this is a good way to build out their components. So something like that I find really useful for building my web applications from little bits into bigger pieces. And if you're working on a design system where you might not actually have a website to actually use your pieces in, a tool like this is a must-have, because you got to view your components somewhere. So the thing I wanted to answer largely tonight is, how is this going to make your life better? And I got to shrink this a little. So the huge thing for me has been faster live reloading. The last two projects I've been on here at Rangle, I'm usually looking at 8 seconds from the time that I hit save to the time that my refreshed website appears and I can interact with the content that's on the screen. And it's like, count with me. This feels like forever. We're there. Awesome. Okay, pretend you just saved the change, and you're going to wait for it. What's that? I'm okay. I don't know. After a while, this stuff starts adding up, and I get distracted. So I found Squirrel TV. I think I can scroll this. Look, you just switch from GIF to GIF over here. Oh, I don't need the full screen one. But come on. I wonder if I'm being A/B tested, because there used to be next and previous arrows here. Anyway, what was I doing 24 seconds ago? Yeah, okay. Getting distracted while waiting for pages to load is one of my largest productivity killers. And with my very finely tuned sense of empathy, I believe that it is everyone else's largest productivity killer also. So when I see someone just waiting and waiting over and over again for their page to reload so they can see their changes, I want to take their keyboard away and set up Storybook for them. Because in my experience on my current 2 projects, this gets the live reload time back down to less than a second. Your JavaScript compilation takes less time. You're sending less information to the browser to load. Since you're running the component's running in isolation, you don't have to wait for your website to make authentication calls to a database somewhere and load a bunch of things into the front end and go through animations before it can show you your changes. You just get your component right in front of you, and it's configured exactly the way you want. And that gives you time to try new things. Assuming you don't use it to rush through your work even faster, you can iterate and try out more ideas and find better solutions, which I really like. And on mobile, it's even better, because your connection's slower, your phone processes JavaScript slower, and if you have to navigate through a few screens to get your app into the state you want, it's really slow on a mobile device. You don't have keyboard shortcuts. Touching is less precise than a mouse. So I have Storybook running again, and what I can demo. Oh, where'd that window go? Oh, this is full screen. That's why this isn't working. I can. Once I find my other window. Where'd that thing go? Terminal. It's halfway between my screens. There we go. So I've got Storybook up and running on my machine right now. And has anyone used ngrok before? One hand. So this is a cool tool. This is an open source. Might not be open source, but it's got a free package. And when I run this is going to open up a tunnel over the internet from my computer. So if anyone pulls out their phone and goes to this URL, they're going to get Storybook being served from my computer on their phone. And then I got to jump back to the right slide and make this bigger. And what's really cool about this, and what has saved me so much time, is when you're looking at your component over here, this is being rendered in an iframe amongst the rest of Storybook's UI, but you can jump out of this iframe and view your component standalone. And when you view this on your phone and you still have live reloading, you can iterate on things so much faster because you still get that less than a second live reload time with nothing else in the way. And for dealing with some tough problems I've had related to scrolling inside of modal windows on iOS, this makes just troubleshooting and trying different fix after different fix so much faster. It's saved me so much time, and I'm just excited to share that. I can turn off this tunnel. shrink that size so I don't get really surprised the next time I see my terminal window and it's huge. And where'd that browser tab go? I feel like I've minimized something that I didn't mean to minimize. That's one window. Oh, I'm flipping through terminal windows. No, give me Chrome. There we go. Okay, bigger, too big. There's an order to this. You drag this down, and then you make it larger. Thank you for making me think about that. Okay, moving on. The other thing I'll point out is kind of like for setting up unit tests. Every time you set up a story for one of your components, every other developer who touches that component after you benefits from it as well. So the time savings pile up, and as your team gets larger and larger, everyone saves more and more time. And I really like having this little 1 second counter down there to remind me, like, this is how fast the live reload is when I'm running in Storybook. The other awesome thing is that, like I showed a little bit, you can put your component into any state you want. So sometimes, well, my example of this is I worked on a website with a 27-step checkout process for buying stuff. It wasn't your average store. So say you need to check that the activity indicator on the last screen after you enter your payment is working okay, or someone tells you, oh, it's not centered right on Safari. Can you go check it out and see if it looks okay? You don't really want to go through those 27 steps every time just to view it and every time you make a change to see if it works. So if you set up your components in a way that, say the loading indicator can be toggled on and off through props, then you can jump straight to it in Storybook. And of course, make this smaller. I need to bring back a window here. So this is way more impressive to talk about than to demo, but oh, and my things are out of sync. Let's refresh this window. Okay, we're back. So because of how I set up my stories just for this presentation, drag this back down, toggle over to knobs, I can just change between is my form submitting or not submitting right now with one checkbox that's readily available. And the more places I find to apply this type of thinking, the better life gets. So I'm happy that's there. Jumping to the next screen. There it goes. This has to get a bit smaller. Is that one legible? Yeah, okay. So in my case, setting up that checkbox is really easy. So I've got, the field set is my component that holds all my form fields and the submit button in it. And I'm using this library called Formic to control that. So it's keeping track of what's in all my input fields and putting them into, I forget if it's using state or context somewhere. And then hooking this up with Storybook, this form that is submitting function represents the actual story that was being rendered on screen, and making that toggle button, making that checkbox and hooking it up to the submit form looks like this. So Boolean means like put a checkbox into that knobs panel. This is the label for it, which is submitting. It's going to default to true so that when I arrive on that screen, the submit button is already animating away. And then I'm passing that value into the Formic context provider, and it's going to force the form to be in that loading state for me. And yeah, working like this really forces you to get to know your libraries better, because you're mocking. It's not kind of like mocking in test-driven development, but it's visual too, so you can see the results of it. The other thing I want to point out is that components developed in isolation are often better. When I'm working in the context of a website and watching my whole screen reload, it's really easy for me to say, like this form has a paragraph under it. I'll just sneak that into the form itself rather than separating it out. And then there's a title or some small legal text underneath that. I'll just put that in the form. It's so easy because it's right here. And before I know it, it's like 1998, and I've built a whole page in one file rather than splitting things up into little components. When I'm hanging out in Storybook's UI, I can zoom this one in, I think. Sometimes I think I'm zooming in this screen instead of that one. This one's a screenshot, so it doesn't zoom in so well. But what I wanted to say was, when I'm working in Storybook, I've got this list on the left of all the components and all the states that people on my team have made already. And this is kind of like peer pressure to keep working in this isolated style of development. Like, I should keep building stories so that I don't break away from this. We all worked hard to make our code like this, so let's keep it going rather than getting sloppy and making things really complicated, making really complicated components. How is this going to make my life worse? Like, there's trade-offs with everything, right? So much like end-to-end tests and unit tests, you're going to end up with a whole nother set of files to maintain, because for every component you have, you're going to make at least one file, possibly with many functions, that manipulates that component and displays it on screen within the context of Storybook. And if you don't, a lot of people never set up Storybook as part of their build process. So I've seen on projects, after people build their components using storybooks, using stories, and then they're done building them, they leave them alone for a while, and then the components change, or a dependency of a component changes, and then the story breaks. But no one notices. And you'll come back and load up Storybook for the first time in a while, and you'll see screens like this with like the red border of death. The story has an error, and you're clicking through stories after story, and you keep finding broken ones, and you can't do the work you want to do without fixing them first. This is still fairly small. Will this one get larger? I figured out you can put iframes into presentations and show actual websites. So there's this idea, Jest, which is a React testing library, had this idea of snapshot testing. And there's now this thing called Storyshots. So you can use the functionality that Jest provides to take snapshots of all your Storybook stories and run that as part of your build process. And then you'll get notified if any one of your stories doesn't work anymore. This is a great thing to set up early in the process, or early in the development of one of your projects. If you find this later on, like midway through a project, it's really tough to add this in, because you have to convince people that this is worth the time to set up, and it's also worth the time to fix all the stories that are broken right now. And that can be a hard sell, because this stuff doesn't really face your clients or your customers. It's just a developer tool. How do I get it to advance? There we go. And when you're working in isolation, it gets really easy to forget to dog food your app. So when I was going through that 27-step checkout process over and over again, many times a day, I found other bugs that I wanted to fix. I found things that could be improved. When I'm working in isolation, those things don't happen. So I want to point out, I had more points. Cool. So I want to point out that Storybook is another tool to use, but it's not a replacement. You're still going to need end-to-end tests to make sure things are working. You'll still probably want some manual exploratory testing to discover new issues. But this isn't going to replace other things. Oh man, I keep talking ahead. Process Quirks. Another tool, it's another new tool with its own set of funny things to remember. So there's things like if you add a new file, a new story into your project, Storybook's like, yeah, sure, I'll show that in the user interface, no problem. if you delete one of those files, Storybook just crashes, and you have to realize or figure out on your own, or listen to me talk, to learn. You have to restart Storybook to get out of this scenario and get your live reloading back. Same idea with syntax errors or runtime errors. Storybook treats these differently, and sometimes you have to refresh or switch stories to get your live reloading functionality back. When I'm trying to convince other people to use this is usually what they say. What if my component depends on too many other things? I have it hooked up to Redux. I have it hooked up to MobX. It can't work standalone. There's too much stuff. Yeah, well, I always forget about CSS. But yeah, you can import your own CSS files so that your styles come through. And you can also wrap your stories with higher order components and React context and mock data so that you can actually test out your component on its own, or your component wrapped up in a surrounded your component in a larger in its context, but with mock data, so you still get that really fast live reload. So my example of this. Did I do this one already? No, I didn't. Oh, so this is a fancier version of that form I had earlier. If I make this larger, is it still usable? Yeah. So there were two things I needed in a previous project. One was localization support. So this can toggle over to French based on, what I think in the real website it was based on probably an operating system setting. But here I've got it just tied to one of these knobs that I've set up already. And I had another project where we were building one set of components but using it across multiple websites. And we were using styled components and its theming abilities to just change some CSS around, probably at build time. But it can also do it at runtime, which is really cool. So in this case, we took the form, and we're wrapping it in some internationalization functionality and some theming functionality. And I wanted to show how this is done, because this will apply to most libraries. You can totally do this with Redux. You can probably do this with React Router and get information about your routes passed through to your components. Yeah, this one. This slide works at that font size. Okay, so this function, we looked at something similar to this. This function represents the story that shows up in that list on the side, and you click it, and you see your components. And we're using an action so that there's a callback when I hit the submit button, so I can show the result of hitting the submit button on the screen. Was that actually there? Actions, sign me up, fill you in. Yeah, that's working. Okay, cool. There's my form data. So the action was what put the form data on the screen. And yeah, this is what's rendering the component. So what you can't see is that subscription form needs two other things. It needs a theme provider from the styled components library so that it can toggle between the green and the violet color. And it needs an internationalization library for sourcing text. And what that looks like, zoom out some more. Yeah, so in this case, I just had to write some more functions to provide there's this concept in, I guess it's a functional programming or a design pattern thing of decorator functions, where it's a function, it takes another object or another function, it wraps it in some other functionality, and then returns the combination of the two. So we're using that pattern. So I've set up a function called withThemeOption, and this is what this theme constant is going to be the result of the select that had violet or green inside of it. And it's going to store whatever the user chose inside of theme. And then this is a theme provider, which comes from the styled component library. And it's going to accept the theme and wrap my story in it. So now when my form goes looking for, like, what color should I be, the theme provider is going to be there to provide it. When I combine the two, what's it look like? This can get larger. Yeah. So this screen was just a function that was sort of standalone. Now we're jumping back to looking at the story. So we saw this a couple screens ago. This is my story. This is what handles people pressing submit, and this is the component being rendered. And when I take this and add this story object onto it, I get to supply a decorators property and put the function that I defined on the last screen into an array on the decorators property, and that's going to provide the functionality I need to be able to switch colors around. And the other super fun thing about that is you still get really fast live reloading as you're editing your theme. So now not only can you edit your components or your form and see the results really quickly, but you can also see the results of changing colors or fonts super quickly as well, or adding a new theme. All that happens super fast. I don't think I have time to go through what the localization provider looks like. It's more complicated, so I'm going to skip that one. The summary, yeah. You should be excited about Storybook because I'm excited about Storybook. The fast live reloading, I hope, will help keep you focused. It'll help you iterate faster and find better solutions to your problems given the same amount of time. Developing your components in isolation outside of their intended application helps you keep them small and composable. Again, I really like having that menu on the side showing all the hard work that's gone into this. It peer pressures me into continuing along the same path rather than getting sort of sloppy. And the other thing is that mocking your component dependencies, like I did with the theme there, really forces you, well, it gives you the ability to switch up your props really quickly, but it also forces you to learn your libraries very well and like what are all the pieces of data that my components depend on and how are they shaped. And I'm hoping that that is going to make me a better developer. Yeah, and that's the end. That's Storybook. Sweet. I have 28% battery left. That's pretty good. Does anyone have questions? I didn't go into a ton of code things. I was mostly excited to show off the UI and workflow improvements. There's a microphone on its way to you.
I know somebody on a different project, they want to have Storybook with components in a separate repo from the applications that use them. Have you seen any workflows like that?
I have not. In my past two projects, Storybook has been in the same repo as the project, like as, say, like the live website and all of its components. In this talk, Storybook is in the same repo as all my slides. If you were to do, I could see that being useful if you had your components in one repo and your application in another repo. I guess you could have a third one for Storybook. I'm not, because I would have a hard time choosing which one of the two repos to put it in. So throw it in a third, why not? But I haven't seen it done, and I haven't tried it yet.
Okay, and
I don't see any major issues popping up aside from just making sure people are looking at all three of them and not ignoring that thing that's off on the side in another repo.
And while I have the mic then, what was the feedback from designers on the project with you working with this component-driven style?
I did not have a ton of feedback from them on my last two projects. I know in other projects in Rangle, they're generally very happy that they can see our interpretation of their work much sooner and much more easily. When I say our, I mean developers. They can see developers' interpretation of their design work much sooner than they would if they're waiting for it to be integrated into a site that has to go through lots of other stages before it can be put in front of them. You're welcome.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the presentation. I had heard about Storybook before, but it wasn't something that I'd considered using. So currently, I use React Router. You mentioned that you wouldn't go into greater detail about other libraries like React Router. So I was wondering if Storybook can be integrated with single-page applications, like especially with React Router, but with other libraries.
For sure. So I haven't how far have I gone with this? So I showed one form being on screen. I have done other work where, say it's like a multi-step process. So within Storybook, I could move from screen to screen and back and forth and make sure that was all working smoothly. I haven't actually put the router into it. I have a feeling, you know how what is it? React Router provides multiple routers. There's one that's based on browser
Right.
history. There's one, I think there's like a memory-based one.
Yes.
And I have a feeling the memory-based one will work okay inside of Storybook. So then if you're using the links that come with React Router and you're clicking between pages, I think they would work in Storybook. It's sort of the next thing to try. Like, as I'm building up from little components to bigger components, could I eventually run my whole application inside of Storybook? And is there a benefit to that? I don't know, but it'd be fun to try.
Right. So I think I'll be using Storybook in the future just based on all the awesome features. So my final question is, sometimes I will develop like a mobile app with React Native, especially with Expo. So like, how would Storybook work in terms of a mobile development environment?
Okay, I haven't tried it out yet, but I do know that there is some kind of React Native support for this. I've seen it in the docs. I think the part where it will get strange is, say, have the components you made, or will the components you make also work in the context of Storybook, which I assume is still going to run in a web browser? I'm not sure. Or is there a version of Storybook that's going to get compiled and run on your phone? I'm not sure which way it's going to go, because I know some applications are developed using components that will run in both the context of a web browser and a mobile app. So that's one way of approaching it. I'm not sure if you can get Storybook itself running on the device if your components are incompatible with web browsers. So I don't know too much about it, but I know it's documented in the Storybook docs.
Have you run into the issue of many variants of the component?
It hasn't been a huge problem yet. There's another Rangle developer who did a talk about this idea of a Cartesian component. Was it Meltem? Yeah? Okay. So she found this component where that you take all the possible props that you could give to your own component, and it'll spit out all the variations possible. And so it's like automatically generating the variants for you. I think they'd all end up in the same story, like on the same screen, on one screen at the same time, which might get overwhelming to look at. But if you're concerned that you have a lot of variations, the Cartesian component could be a cool way to try and see them all at once.
Yes, but sometimes it's like, the designer wants to, like, the error message above the form field, or they're below, or they're left align or right align. Sometimes it just, it could easily create many variants, and I find it hard to manage.
If your designer wants that many variants, I figure Storybook is still a better place to view them than within the context of the application you're actually developing. But you may still have to, if it's unmanageable in both scenarios, you may still have to try and negotiate a way to simplify it. I don't think it'll solve that type of complexity for you. More hands up? No? One more hand. Hey.
Hi, Adam.
Hello.
Great talk. So I had a question about story shots. I didn't know that Storybook has them. And I know that just snapshots are pretty controversial. What do you think about story shots?
So I guess the controversy with running them in Jest is something along the lines of, your component
People
has
tend to
changed, and now you
ignore
have
the
to.
output.
Sorry, can you
People
repeat?
tend to ignore broken snapshots.
Oh yeah, so you're totally going to have the same issue with doing this in Storybook. Can I get the docs back? I think it would be awesome if you could configure it to say just break the build if one of my components fails to render or throws an error. If the output changes, well, that's probably fine. I haven't looked into this tool enough to know if that's possible or not. But I can totally feel why people ignore the output from Jest, because it's something like it could be on every commit or every push you do. You just get notified of failures that you don't really care about.
Right, and what do the snapshots exactly look like? Does it render images, or how does it work?
It's a text file. I forget if it's HTML or something. So it's something that represents the structure of your component. I forget if it's actually the HTML that your component would render to, or if it's some other intermediate format.
So
But
is
it's a
it
text
exactly
file
like-
that you can commit into a versioning system.
Is it exactly like just snapshots?
Yeah, I believe it's using the Jest code behind the scenes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good talk. What do you think about using storybooks on very abstracted components? So generally when I use it, I've come to realize that it's very beneficial in the lowest level, most atomic ones, like when you're designing visual components that may be part of your design system or your component library, like a card, a button, an avatar. But then it starts to get very hard as you go up that DOM tree, and you're starting to kind of like previous question here was saying, like on the route level. At that point, there's so many sub-contexts, there's so many other dependencies. In your opinion, do you think it's worth it?
Based on my experience the past 2 weeks with our new project, yes, I'd say so. It's forced me, so I've used it as sort of I just joined a new project and I'm trying to convince people to use Storybook more. And it has forced me to learn the ins and outs of the project. Like how does this thing actually work through all these layers of abstraction. So I'm not sure if actually rendering the stories is very useful, but forcing me to go through the application layer by layer in a way that I wouldn't if I was just grabbing a ticket out of Jira to fix something, that's been beneficial to me. There was a hands over there. Those are the ones I saw. I forget my apologies if there were hands on this side.
Hi, so my question is, if you have, say, a component that's living in Storybook and that's already existing and you're coming in to make a small change to it, do you have any strategy that you follow to make sure that you haven't added any regressions to wherever you're using it in your actual application?
Nothing super clever. I'm a big fan of just having some end-to-end tests. I feel like, I'm not sure if snapshots would help you in that case. It might, if those could tell you that some other component that depends on the component you just edited broke, then that could tell you. But I feel like end-to-end tests are more useful in terms of, sometimes things break, but they don't look right anymore. But it's still okay to deploy because it still works. At least when you're under pressure to deliver features quickly. It's like, yeah, deploy it, fix it later. So on my experience from the last couple of projects, people have been happy with if the end-to-end test passes and a human looks at it and goes, it's not great, but it's usable, we'll deploy it and fix it later. That's sort of been the strategy. I think snapshots will get you a tighter QA cycle, less regressions. But they also come with the overhead of approving or disapproving snapshots every time you change something, which sometimes isn't desirable. It depends on, are you seeking perfection or are you seeking moving quickly?
Okay, thanks.
So you said you joined a new project and you're trying to convince them to use Storybook more. What strategies do you have that this is how we got the team to use Storybook more?
I'm still working on it. It's mostly been about the live reloading, because I picture 10 developers waiting 8 seconds many, many times a day. If you add up all that time, it's pretty expensive. A lot of the people have been on the team for much longer than me, so the idea of being forced to go through their stack of components and context and learn it inside out so they can mock the fake data, that's less useful to them. So I can't really use that. When QA issues come up, like what the person beside you said, how do you tell if something has broken? The idea that you can click, as you're going through Storybook, you might find other stories that are broken. That's a hint that something could be broken inside your application. Something that I haven't had to do, but other people on the team have realized as a reason to use Storybook more, is reducing duplicate work. So we're finding 5 copies of a button that looks very similar spread out throughout the code base. If someone had a directory of components that they could search through and see, oh, there's a button I can use, that would save them a lot. That would save a lot of duplicate code and a lot of time, and get more consistent styles across their site. But I haven't had to convince anyone of that. That's slowly happening on its own over time as more people join the team.
Thanks for the great presentation, Adam. Storybook has quite a couple of extensions that look pretty useful. Do you have any recommendations around which extensions are particularly useful, or which one have you been using in the projects previously?
So on my previous project, I'd say our install of Storybook looked more fully loaded, but not everything was useful. So something that I thought was cool was there was a third, oh, I'm on the wrong monitor again. We had a third tab over here that could do contrast checking for accessibility and tell you whether or not I'm not sure exactly what it was checking, but maybe foreground, background contrast was that at the acceptable level. And I thought that was super cool that it put it right in front of you in an easy to access way. You didn't have to go type in hex codes into some other tool. But our client wasn't so concerned about accessibility, so it wasn't that useful in the end. I've seen other versions, other add-ons that put a tool up here that'll let you change the size of this window. So it'll give you like a responsive window. You can toggle between give me iPhone 5 sized or give me Pixel 3 sized, and then your responsive components will adapt to it. The problem on that previous project was some of our components also did like device sniffing, and this doesn't change the user agent, or that extension to Storybook didn't change the user agent, so we couldn't get an accurate read out of what the component would look like on the device, unfortunately. On other projects, that could be great, though. Those are the two that come to the top of my mind right now.
Thanks.
We might be done. Whoa. Cool. Thank you.
All right, so maybe before we get started with the presentation, just maybe a quick show of hands. How many people here use Redux, or at least know what it is and probably use it in their applications? Perfect. So the main reason I asked this question is I don't really plan on covering the basics of Redux at all. I just want to get a show of the room because I think maybe the documentation itself could do a better job than I do. And on top of that, we're probably going to take this whole presentation more from a architectural and modeling perspective, and probably use that to identify what I consider is the biggest anti-pattern when using Redux. It's not in the library itself, but it's more about how we tend to use it. So with that said, my name is Yazan Alaboudi. I work at Rangle as a software developer. I'm part of their delivery team, so my job is to kind of build applications for our clients as well. So a really funny thing that I've come to realize about us developers is we tend to perceive
our projects in the exact same way throughout its life cycle. And what I kind of mean by that is, when we all start the project, I bet you most of us kind of tend to feel like this. Everyone feels really ecstatic about the fact that they're going to start a new project, they're going to put their ideas into it, it's going to be great, it's going to be wonderful. But you know what makes it even more special about our bond? We all kind of tend to have a unanimous feeling when you're in. It sucks. And this is something I've come to realize tends to happen throughout my projects. I mean, 1 year in, tends to be the feeling, and this kind of made me realize, oh, what is it that's going on? We use React, we use Redux, it supposedly helps us predict our applications better and better, but it becomes just a really hot mess throughout. So to formalize it better, I've come to realize we probably have a scalability issue. So the question of, I have my application today, how can I make it predictable and readable and understandable as it grows bigger and bigger? So scalability is not a new problem. I mean, development's been around for 40, 50 years, and this problem has already been solved by backend developers. Backend developers have kind of done this thing, and most likely done it in microservices. I will not talk about microservices at all, but if you guys don't know what it is, it's instead of having one big app, you have a lot of small mini backend services. But it's really interesting to know because they've handled this issue very well. So for the beginning of this presentation, we're going to basically look at it from that lens, the backend developer lens. We're going to back up a little bit afterwards, see how we can use React or Redux to actually tackle our problems in the exact same way, and then identify, well, what is the anti-pattern? So let's do an exercise. We all work at Evil Corp. We sell insurance policies. While we work there, we're software developers, and we have a PO that tells us, hey, we want this requirement to be done. The requirement that we have today is when a user successfully subscribes or purchases a policy, we must bill the user every month. Sounds very simple. So these are our two microservices, the policy service. The policy service is only responsible for purchasing this policy or subscribing the policy. The billing service, on the other hand, is only responsible for one thing, making sure the customer gets billed every month. Super simple. So the interaction with these backend services may look something like this. You get an HTTP call. You would get the policy service would create the policy and will follow up by creating an API call to the billing service to tell it, now you do your thing. This works well on a very small scale, but let's just see what keeps happening as we get more and more requirements coming in. So our next requirement is also, we want to send the user a confirmation email to make sure that they bought something, it's in their email as well. So easy enough, you do the exact same thing. You develop an email service if you're a backend developer. You take down the policy service, do that extra API call, and then you redeploy it. Simple. Now more stuff starts coming in. You're like, send an appreciation letter. You build a parcel service. You take it down. You write that new code so that there's an extra API call. So right now you're left with this. One HTTP call coming into the policy service, and all these other services get triggered through an API call. But the issue is, you know what, more will come in. And what will end up happening is it will kind of start looking like that, and you know what, this is basically 1 year in. So it gets pretty bad from there. So now the question is, well, how did backend people really solve this? In microservices, they tended to go with an architectural style called pub/sub. If you don't know what that is, we will show you. So instead of getting the policy service and the billing service to talk directly with one another, instead, we put something in between. We would just say the billing service is interested in knowing when a policy has been purchased, and now the policy server, when it gets that exact same HTTP call, the only thing it's responsible for doing is notifying the entire system a policy has been purchased. Now, assuming that the other requirements came in and we actually did this correctly, they could be listening for the exact same things on the network, and the policy service never has to go down because it is responsible for one thing, which is just reporting on the fact that a policy has been purchased. it doesn't need to care about how this piece of information is taken care of. It is just responsible for the main thing it's responsible for, which is creating that policy. Right. So just to kind of go through more of a formal definition here, the policy service is what we call the publisher, and the message bus there is the bus itself, and the subscribers are the things that are interested in the events themselves. So the publisher itself here, as we can see, published the event, and it's really important that we note this word, event, that happens in our system. And there's few reasons to why this really works. So if we go back, there's two main principles that PubSub actually follows, which is the subscribers don't need to know who published the message, and the publisher does not need to know who's interested in the message. And this is the main reason things scale. There's no coupling between anything. So I was going to say, so this whole architectural setup should look familiar. If we replace those words, since everyone here does Redux, you probably understand this. You've probably seen these in other presentations as well. You have a dispatcher that sends something over to the NPM library, which we call Redux, and it's responsible for informing all your reducers of this message. So my big claim here is Redux is just a synchronous pub-sub system. That is all that it is. So let's talk about how not to use a pub-sub system, though. So if we look back at this example that we saw earlier, a terrible message to be listening to if you were the billing service is something like start billing. At that point, you're forcing the policy service here to dispatch something called start billing. Does this seem familiar? Do most of your actions look like this, like set this, do this, change that? So, and here, if you have your email service and it's responsible for send confirmation, you do the exact same thing, but now you have to take down the policy service to make sure you're dispatching that. Now, same thing for the parcel service, and you end up like this, and this is more familiar again. Because you're doing the exact same thing over and over and over. And honestly, this thing in the middle is just getting in the way at the moment. So there's no point of doing any of this. So don't do this. If you're a backend developer that does this, don't do this. So the main reason this doesn't work is because we violated the first principle of PubSub, which is publishers should be unaware of its subscribers. If there is a very important business event that occurs in your service, you shouldn't care about who is listening. You should just report that very important business information. So this is basically, unfortunately, how we use Redux, the bad way, not the good way. We keep informing, most of our actions that get dispatched target specific reducers. And this is the biggest anti-pattern that I've come to realize. Like, we no longer start reporting on business events. Instead, what we start doing is, well, we report state mutation. So the proposal here is when we have an action type, it should report an important business event and not a state mutation nor a command. And this could have vast implications, and the best way for me to show you any of this is to give you an example, and there will be a little code here to go with. So let's assume you have a soccer game app. The exact same thing happens again. You have, when a player scores a goal, you want to increment the scoreboard. This is very easy code to follow, but let's kind of showcase it how it would look like if we did it using this command action pattern, which is the do this, do that message. So you have your reducer here. All that it's listening to is increment score, and as you can see, as the reducer itself will just increment the score for the winning team. And now as you kind of get more requirements coming in, so imagine now a second requirement is, hey, when a goal is scored, the crowd should also get excited, and you're simulating that with your Redux application. So we start putting our second reducer down there, or it starts off with an initial state of 0, which is not excited, and it basically is listening for an action called increase crowd excitement and increases it by +1. So, but what is the consequence of this? Wherever it is that you're dispatching your actions when a goal is scored, you're probably doing something like this. You're doing dispatch, dispatch. And I've seen few code bases already that kind of look like this. Also, by the way, maybe I did not put this in my presentation slides. If you dispatch something and you catch in your side effect handler and dispatch again, it's still the same issue. So let's kind of talk about the main disadvantages you will get here. All of these messages that are going around your system does not even capture business semantics at all. And they're fully coupled to the reducer. And in addition, you've just seen that there's 2 actions being fired, but potentially there could have been a lot more actions being fired right there. You probably could have gotten like, doesn't matter. You could probably have a lot more in the future. And this is a biggie. You're not quite sure why the state is changing. So let's imagine if you had that crowd state that you're looking at, it just says increase crowd excitement. You're like, well, why, if you're just looking there? And then you're taking advantage of the fact that people made really good IDEs, and it's covering for the fact that your code architecture is subpar. And it leads to a lot of boilerplate. Who here has heard the argument Redux has a lot of boilerplates? Every single time you want to put a reducer, you put an action, you put a thing, you put a that, and then you get a lot of people going like, you know what, we should use Apollo. And then this becomes more of an argument that we hear every now and then. So, and in the end, this is my final one, which is it does not scale well. So let's take a look how we can kind of flip this on its head by actually just changing the message that we're kind of distributing across the system. Instead of doing stuff like increase score or get crowd more excited, the only thing what we're doing is we're getting them to listen to the exact same thing, which is a goal has been scored. The component itself that reports a goal has been scored has no idea what reducers are listening. It's the publisher, and all the subscribers are your reducers. Your reducers are their own isolated systems that can kind of that can basically respond to these actions on their own. And when you look back at the same component, you only have one thing there, which is just that dispatch. Very clean. All right, and this is probably my favorite part, talking about the advantages of this, because it has a lot of architectural implications to it. So if we start talking about the best advantage is clarity over why your state is changing. Your reducers become the spec file. Immediately, you can reverse engineer the requirements your PO gave you. You're looking at that, I am incrementing the score because a goal has been scored. Also, actions and reducers are not coupled and less boilerplate. So, also a big message here. A lot of times when I first started using Redux, I started writing my reducers and then the actions to change it, and then there'll be a coupling of 1-to-1. What it's supposed to be is 1-to-n reducers. So you basically get one action that goes out, and potentially a lot of reducers are listening in on that same action. Also, when you look here, instead of having it look like that, we only have one dispatcher at the moment, not 2, or multiple potentially. So basically right now we've reduced a lot of that boilerplate as well. Actually, there is no less of a way to express yourself than doing it this way. And the whole argument of Redux has a lot of boilerplate just seems to fade at this point. All right. And this is also one of my favorites, the fact that you get to develop your whole application in an event-driven manner. You could take advantage of event-driven architectures, BDD, and event storming techniques just when designing your application. So what I mean by that is your entire application becomes a function of this line. When some actor, which is a user, a system, time, whatever it is, does something, do something. This is basically your entire application now. So actor, just going over it just a little bit, in my opinion, this is the missing terminology in Redux. We never talk about why things are happening. It's very interesting when you start thinking like, what is the actor in my system that is causing the event? You start thinking differently about your modeling. And the whole point of this talk right now is to say our actions should be events. And lastly, at the bottom here, also this is probably a biggie, so you guys might heckle me. Everything we do in our application, even when using Redux, is a side effect. Actually, I'll take it one step further. Redux is a side effect handling library. What I mean by that is, a side effect is when you do an HTTP call, more broader, a side effect is any observed change or behavior. We have complicated this definition beyond no limit, but that's all that it simply means. And to see a behavior or change, you must change in-memory variables. You should do an HTTP call and all these things. But really, it's all a matter of perspective. So meaning, the Redux library says you write things in a side effect-free way, and a very tiny line in that NPM library is the side effect, which is how it changes state. So if you start thinking about it that way, it becomes really easy to identify where you should be putting your code. So for example, if your actor, which is the user, as your user does things on your application, and the side effect is just changing your state, your code goes in your reducer. And similarly, if the user is changing something else, not in state, like potentially scheduling something, maybe you're putting something in the local storage or HTTP call, you do that through a custom side effect handler, not the Redux side effect handler, which is Redux Saga, Redux Observables, and all that sort of stuff. And it's more interesting if you look at it as, what if the actor is not the user? Not the user meaning when you get a response back from the server is the actor, not the user, and the state, and basically the state is being updated maybe with the response. So you still put that, guess what, in two places, in the custom, and you put that in your reducer as well, and so forth. Just a really quick tip on writing good actions. Think of the really important business event that you're trying to convey that is worth responding to. That is basically your action. And a big one here, please don't take this as a message to couple the UI in the event. So for example, don't let an action kind of look like this. User clicked on checkbox. Your action, again, I said in the first point, should be related to business events, so it should be more like user agreed to terms and conditions. Big difference. Because right now, maybe the terms and conditions may not be represented through a checkbox, but maybe through a button or whatever. But you're completely isolating that coupling. And when you've kind of made sure that it may be potentially used by many reducers in the future, that means you're on a good track. Even though if you're just using it in one, but potentially in the future you could have many. So I'm going to possibly wrap up, but the main message here is there's nothing wrong with the Redux library. It's actually perfect. It's amazing. It's just about sometimes it's worth kind of taking a second look about how you use something and thinking about what role a library plays in its architectural mechanic. There is a lot of, I'm not original when I bring this conversation up. Actually, the first time I really started thinking heavily is when someone was saying, is Redux conflating actions with events on the Redux, in the Redux issue bar. Even Dan Abramov actually had a nice saying, he's like, if your actions look like set this, you've missed the whole point of using Redux. And I think he's talking about exactly this, what we're talking about right now. And there's a whole article about why the fact that action is a terrible name for actions. And in my humble opinion, it should have been called events. It would have been much more clear in the first place. Unfortunately, this is basically a manifestation of the Flux architecture, which had its own audience, and the word action was already familiar to them. So I kind of hope you took something away from this. This was more of an architectural discussion about how you should use something, assuming that we all know what Redux is. Thank you very much. That's actually everything I have. If you guys have any Q&A, this is probably a good time to do it.
Great presentation. Very much in agreement with what you're saying. For components, for the actions that are about user interface and selecting things, like select is one of those verbs that's really difficult to convert to an event. Have you encountered this being reframed in a sort of a naming scheme? Basically, you switch to a lot of past tense in your action names, like
Events are naturally in past tense.
and events are past tense, so the actions would become. I've encountered people on my team find it a bit awkward to name things like user something wanted. Like when a user selects a thing, it's just like selected, but that tends to bind it too much to the UI.
I think it's still fair because in the end of the day, the user is selecting,
Right.
or it's fair. You could just still say select and it's fine.
Right. So do you find that that's what happened in your kind of experience too, that a lot of the names of actions and reducers and all of that switched to past tense?
Only the actions turn to past tense.
Yeah.
The reducers themselves are actually almost the same, still the same way that they are. The reducers don't change very much. It's just what you're listening to.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great talk, thank you for that. I had a quick question about when we're dealing with backend endpoints, when you need to work with multiple backend endpoints to achieve one thing, and each one of them give you a different response to put into your reducer. But you have one action that you'd need to call 3 or 4 different endpoints. How would you deal with that? How would you look at that in this sense?
So let me make sure I understood you correctly. So if you have one action that has multiple endpoints and you get them and they go to different reducers, you said?
Let's say, let's look at it like a save button,
Right.
which when you wanted to make a save, it has to update one, like add a few things, delete a few things, and then mutate one specific item.
Right.
It does
In the
3 different
backend.
calls
In
on
the
the back end.
Yeah.
But it would still, and each one of these responses would come back in a different, as something different to put into your reducer.
Well, the way I see it is it important that all of them succeed for it to be a successful call for the user? In that case, the fact that it's 3 is just a matter of implementation detail. So when you kind of throw it out, you probably do your 3 API calls, you wait for the 3, and then you say, we've succeeded with another action.
Thank you.
Hello. So I noticed you used a BDD style. You said like when this happens, then this result should happen.
Yes.
So have you found, in your opinion, that by doing this way of creating your actions, that overall the code base is easier to test?
Oh yeah. So basically this kind of almost enforces the fact that, you know, the whole single responsibility principle, as long as you can realize that your action handler meets this, you're almost only just doing one major thing. So and when it comes to testing, it is super easy to test because you're not coupling a lot of different responsibilities, you're just doing one thing, which is when blah, 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 then do that. You're just testing that, do that. Yep.
Thanks for the talk, Yazan. So I would agree that Redux is good for catching any unexpected behaviors. You mentioned, you mentioned that it's important to name the business HTTPS request separately. So I was wondering if you would suggest that action creators should be named specific to each HTTP request because they might be using multiple backend APIs.
No, so I didn't say that. Maybe I miscommunicated, sorry. But I'm just saying, like, whatever it is that the user is expecting or the user is requesting, that intent that they're trying to do is what you're trying to capture. That intent is the business semantic you're trying to capture.
Oh, okay.
And whether that results in 1 or 5 or 10 API calls, you shouldn't care.
Thanks.
Great talk. Just wondering, will these slides be up anywhere? Where could we find them?
You know, that's I probably maybe after this, maybe I'll probably put it up somewhere in the meetup channel. Probably publish it then. But no, they're not available. I just finished these recently, so yeah.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Do you use Redux Saga, or how do you fit in the picture here?
I don't care very much generally, but if you're asking for my own personal preference, I liked Redux Observables a lot, just because they follow that. Observables by nature are event-driven, so I kind of steer towards that direction. But it shouldn't really make a difference. You could choose whatever you want. I think we might be done. All right.